So I recently made this post on Facebook in a moment of passion and a moment of frustration, and I had written something that often I find that I try and sit down in front of the camera here, or in certain situations, my words escape me. But often when I'm underneath my welding helmet or I'm at work or whatever, I get these little moments of inspiration. I'll write something like this out on my phone, and occasionally I'll share it. Um, So pardon some of the language, but get used to it. This is what I wrote. I said, your country, along with its economy and your prospect of a future, are being steadily dissolved. You won't say anything because you're scared of being bullied by the fat, useless, unemployed, vapid, hair-dyed freaks who make up 60% of Gen Z. Your parents have turned into soup for brains fools who can only go along to get along. They have no political concerns outside their own comfort. So here are you, stuck in a shit sandwich between two slices. The vile, bitter, seething, conformist faggots who got smartphones from age 4, and your adult parents who are now also, ironically, completely sucked into their bloody phones and can't find an ounce of political will to do anything, but who have multiple homes. You'll spend the best years of your life paying tax to support these two groups. Your dying parents, who hate you and want you to live in a worse country, a place unrecognisable, a complete wasteland where nothing works as it should. And the dregs of your own desperately confused generation, myopically focused on their sexuality and self-expression. Sweaty fatties and weak-willed androgynous retards whose idea of danger is a word they don't like. These two groups will receive a minimum of 50% of the tax revenue of the country in benefits, social support, and pensions. So, good luck. On one side, you have the indifference of people who've already made it, and on the other, you have the seething jealousy and hateful ideology of a generation obsessed with themselves and too sick to function. It's a good thing you weren't raised to work hard, to desire and pursue a family, a home of your own, a meaningful career, representative politics, democratic processes, expendable income, and freedom, because if you were, you'd probably be quite disappointed right now. It's a good thing you didn't invest the best years of your life paying ever increasing taxes into a system that seeks to exploit you and redistribute the rewards of your labour to politicians, immigrants, and the infirm, because if you did, you might be a little upset. I got a surprising amount of love for that, but out of the 15 people that engaged with that or liked that, despite the obvious political nature, no one wants to touch anything political. The apathy is rampant. But out of the 15 people that liked that post, one of them was a woman. Um, which to me at least indicates either that I've got way more male friends than female friends, that I'm a rampant sexist, or that men sometimes seem to notice these trends more than their female counterparts. I think in this instance it was because the one woman who liked this post is a mother, um, and also a native, someone who's tanga whenua of this country, so probably has a strong spiritual connection to wanting this country to be as safe and as prosperous a place as it could possibly be for her children, and out of respect to her ancestors. And that's a bit how I feel as well. So I am interested in these sorts of trends. The trend of, for instance, our generation to struggle to find and hold on to meaningful work and to find meaning in their lives, um, and also of this wealth transfer. And so, since we're in the age of AI, I thought we'd just look into some of these issues. And so here I am. I've got my search up here. How has youth participation in the workforce changed in the last 20 years? And here's what Google has to say. Over the last 20 years, youth participation in the workforce has transformed from a straightforward path of early employment to a highly cyclical, education-delayed, and increasingly volatile landscape. Globally, and in nations like New Zealand, young people aged 15 to 24 have transitioned from consistent entry-level jobs toward prolonged higher education, facing structural shifts that culminate in a 30-year high in youth unemployment as of 2026. And we've got a news article there. Um, that could be interesting. Youth unemployment climbs the highest level in more than 30 years. Structural delays and rising economic inactivity. The largest trend over the last 2 decades is the postponement of entering the workforce. Youth participation in full-time education has climbed significantly, hitting record levels globally. So we're more educated than ever. We're getting more degrees. That's great. I'm sure they're all really useful, all of those degrees. The inactivity shift. Millions of young people are now classified as economically inactive. However, this is largely positive inactivity, as the number of young people choosing full-time study over a paycheck has nearly doubled since the early 2000s. Now, obviously that's one way to look at it, but the other way to look at it is that those people, almost twice as many of them, are taking on debt to pursue higher education instead of producing anything of value in those years. And maybe there's something to be said about perhaps encouraging more young people to pursue trades or practical skills straight out of school instead of going straight to higher education. I think maybe school is more than enough in some cases for some people to completely fry their brains and find themselves shifting toward the 30-year high in youth unemployment. A rollercoaster of volatility, 2006 to 2026. Youth are always the first fired, last hired during economic shifts, making their workforce participation incredibly volatile over a 20-year timeline. This is our generation, 2007 to 2013. Youth participation plummeted to historical lows as entry-level positions evaporated. 2021 to 2023. Extreme labour shortages sucked youth out of education and back into the workforce. Teen participation spiked sharply up to nearly 54% due to aggressive wage inflation. And then 2024 to 2026, the cycle reversed brutally. Economic cooling has caused youth unemployment to skyrocket to 17.3%, meaning young adults are currently bearing the brunt of the modern job downturn. When I was a young'un, double-digit unemployment would have been all over the news. But this is 17%. That's interesting. I'm not sure where that stat comes from. Unverified, whatever. The tracking of youth not in employment, education, or training has evolved deeply over 20 years. The long-term scarring effect. Long-term data now proves that a youth spending a long spell as being not in employment, as a NEET, someone not in employment, education, or training, severely reduces their full-time employment prospects well into their 30s, often trapping them in low-skilled occupations later in life. The modern NEET profile has shifted from just school dropouts to include a complex mix of young parents lacking childcare, young people dealing with mental health barriers, and graduates facing an over-credentialed job market. Okay, interesting point. So we are at a 30-year unemployment, and let's have a look at this. Let's just go. How has housing? Oh, let's rephrase this. How have house prices in NZ changed in the last 50 years when compared to median household income? Over the last 50 years, the relationship between house prices and household incomes in New Zealand has completely decoupled, transforming the country from one of the world's most affordable housing markets into one of the most severely unaffordable. In the 1970s and 1980s, when your parents were about your age, a typical New Zealand home cost roughly 2 to 3 times the average annual household income. By 2026, despite recent market corrections, the nationwide house price to income ratio sits between 7 and 7.7 times income, and peaked as high as 8.7 times income in 2022. This means house prices have grown roughly 4 times faster than household incomes over the last half century. 50 years of the house price to income ratio. The standard international metric for housing affordability is the demographic. Okay, interesting. I've just got another interesting question that pops into mind. How has GDP per capita, I'll specify NZ, how has NZ GDP per capita changed over the last 50 years How has this impacted the cost of living? I'll just add, please adjust for inflation. Over the last 50 years, New Zealand's inflation-adjusted real GDP per capita has roughly doubled, climbing from 22,000 to just over 44,000 in constant real terms. However, this growth has not been a smooth upward trajectory. It was marked by extreme stagnation in the 1970s and 80s, followed by steady growth after structural economic deregulation, and hitting a volatile flatline period through to 2026. Paradoxically, while macro-level economic productivity per person has doubled, the real cost of living has outpaced actual discretionary purchasing power due to severe structural imbalances in the domestic economy. Okay, I'm going to do this. I'm a simple man. Keep it dumb for me. Why not? Here is the short, simple version. Housing, worse. 50 years ago, a house cost 3 years of wages. Today, a house costs 7 to 8 years of wages. Result, houses are much harder to buy. It takes 2 incomes now instead of 1. GDP, economy size, better on paper. 50 years ago, New Zealand produced less. Today, the country makes twice as much money per person after adjusting for inflation. Result, we are a richer country, but you don't feel it in your wallet. Cost of living, worse. The extra money we make is being swallowed up by bills. The culprits, high housing costs, expensive groceries, and skyrocketing bills like insurance. Result, even though we produce more, everyday life feels more expensive and stressful. Okay, how has this impacted people's family lives? How has the NZ birth rate changed over the last 50 years? NZ citizens only. Over the last 50 years, the New Zealand birth rate has collapsed to its lowest level in recorded history. In 1976, Kiwi women averaged nearly 2.8 births per lifetime. By mid-2026, that number plummeted to an all-time low of just 1.53 births per woman. So you could read that as women now feel half as safe. Because ultimately the women who wanted to have kids are going to be the ones who had kids. 50 years ago, they had the vote and they could work and they could do what they wanted. So in 1976, the women who were having children were choosing to have children. And in 2026, the women that were choosing to have children were choosing having children. And that number has plummeted to an all-time low of just 1.53 births per woman. This is far below the 2.1 replacement rate needed for a population to sustain itself without relying on overseas immigration. What? Needed for a population to sustain itself without relying on overseas immigration. 50 years of declining numbers. Demographers look at the total fertility rate. 2000. It went from 1976 to 2000, 24 years. It went from 2.8 to 2, which is already danger zone, just under the sustainable line. And in 2026, 1.53, all-time historic low of rates of birth. The average age of a Kiwi mum giving birth was roughly 25 in 1976. Now it is 31.7. Young mums are rare. Births to women under 25 have dropped by half in just one generation. The cost trap. Because house prices, rent, and groceries have eaten up wages, many Kiwi couples simply cannot afford to take time off work or pay for childcare. Having 0 or only 1 child has become the default economic choice. Women are more highly qualified and work full-time careers compared to 50 years ago. Life goals have shifted from massive family, childlessness is rising, fewer couples are having 3 or 4 kids, instead average family sizes are tiny. What this means for the future. Because the citizen birth rate is so low, New Zealand's future population growth is almost completely dependent on international migration. Without immigration, the Kiwi workforce would eventually shrink and age rapidly. So we need... How have immigration rates into NZ changed over the last 50 years? Over the last 50 years, immigration into New Zealand has changed from a trickle of British settlers into a massive, volatile global tap that now keeps the entire economy afloat. And we've basically reached the point that now I can't help but offer my opinion, which is I've heard a lot of talk over the last few years about how capitalism is slavery. And there was even a very famous Rick and Morty episode where they did the like sounds like slavery with extra steps thing, and it was like I think Rick had invented a battery, but like inside the battery was another universe. The battery was like a multiverse battery or omniverse battery or whatever, and there was this like miniverse inside the battery where everyone was generating power in the battery by like undergoing a capitalist economic system, and the tax that they paid was the electricity for the battery or something like that. And Morty introduces the moral concern about like, isn't this kind of just like slavery with extra steps? Like, aren't these creatures in this universe which you've created, in the system which you've created, kind of enslaved because they've got no choice? There's no way for them to feed their families. There's no way for them to keep their economy afloat without these new measures. There's no way for them to afford to have these children unless they do the work. And I think in the thing it's just some mundane activity. In the real world, the slavery with extra steps that you hear about all the time is the capitalist system. And like I am traditionally a pro-capitalist person. I'm a capitalist person, but I'm now becoming ever more comfortable with the phrase late-stage capitalism, which seems to perfectly describe the situation we're living in at the moment, where even though if you read like The Wealth of Nations, if you go back to old like John Adams, like the fundamentals of it, there's like this phenomenal egalitarian kind of this swelling, soaring feeling you get reading these economic theories about how everyone's combined work through the division of labor and the appropriate use of economic systems will result in just broad spectrum wealth. And in some ways, I think we're being convinced that we have that because I can buy like a wireless mouse for like $5 or whatever. I bought some wireless microphones the other day, a pair of wireless microphones and a receiver, USB rechargeable microphones and a receiver for 25 New Zealand dollars. Just insanity. But at the same time, the actual means of a good life, like the materials which make up the assets and the things which make up a good life, which sometimes aren't things. Sometimes it's not the new iPhone. Sometimes it's like having the ability to be a stay-at-home parent and spend more time with your kid, or it's the ability to relieve your spouse of their working duties by earning enough money. It is the ability to take time off or go on a holiday or to buy your child like a musical instrument or something like that. So a lot of those things are actually what constitute a good life now, or what have always constituted a good life. But those things are far more difficult to attain. The free time to be able to afford a home, to be able to afford to have one person in a couple stay home with the kids is increasingly unaffordable, and the pressure is on. And it's slavery with extra steps. But as long as they're from overseas, it's all good. Okay? Because we can balance out, and then we won't be enslaving these people. We'll be giving them economic opportunities, and we'll be doing that out of the kindness of our heart, and also the bare necessity. And so what you'll find is that, as per usual, these sorts of changes are gradual. Like, let's have a look at this. How has the individual tax burden in NZ changed over the last 50 years? Over the last 50 years, New Zealand's individual tax burden has completely flipped. The government slashed sky-high income tax rates but introduced everyday taxes on spending to make up the difference. However, because the government rarely adjusted tax brackets for decades, a process called bracket creep, or fiscal drag, has slowly pushed average wage earners into higher tax brackets over time. Furthermore, a large share of the tax burden now falls heavily on wages rather than wealth. 50 years ago, New Zealand had an incredibly high tax system for high income earners. The top marginal income tax rate was 66% in 1970s and 1980s. Rogernomics dropped it to 33% in the 80s, and then today the top income tax rate sits at 39%. The birth of GST, and this is something that a lot of our generation don't understand, is that to make up for slashing income tax, the government introduced the goods and services tax in 1986. So GST, which started at 10% in 1986, here it is here. In 1986, GST started at 10% on almost everything you bought. It became 12.5% in our youth, and now it's 15%. This shifted the tax burden. 50 years ago, you were heavily taxed when you earned money. Today, you were taxed when you earn it and an extra 15% every single time you spend it at the supermarket, petrol station, or hardware store. There's also additional taxes on things like petrol. The bracket creep trap, even though official tax rates are lower than in the 1970s, everyday workers have faced a silent tax hike over the last 20 years. Okay. How have NZ national asset holdings changed over the last 50? I imagine Google's going to get very suspicious if these searches quite soon. Over the last 50 years, New Zealand's national asset holdings have completely transformed. But it started every single answer with that. Over the last 50 years, it's completely transformed. Now, do you feel, has it gotten better? I mean, I've only got 31 years of experience. I've only been sentient for like 25, 26 years at that time. So, I personally don't feel it's gotten any better in my lifetime. But, whatever. Let's have a read. The government went from owning almost every major industry to selling off billions in corporate assets while shifting its focus to managing public infrastructure and a massive national savings fund. That's KiwiSaver, I believe. Keeping it simple, so that's your money. They sold. Oh my gosh, they sold all the assets so that they could then replace the value by using your money off your paycheck to do it. They were like, oh, we won't need the national assets, but you're gonna need to start immediately paying into your KiwiSaver to suss that out. Anyways, 50 years ago, the New Zealand government acted like a giant national corporation. The Crown completely owned and operated all telecommunications, the major banks, all rail, domestic air travel and shipping lines, commercial forest, state coal mines, and the entire electricity grid, even hotels, tourist agencies, and the printing office. Man, New Zealand was like a real thing. Late 1980s and 1990s, the Great Fire Sale, privatisation. Following the economic crisis of the mid-1980s, the government radically changed its approach, believing that private businesses could run these industries more efficiently. They sold off more than 19 billion worth of state assets to private buyers and foreign corporations. I wonder what that's worth in modern money. Sold completely telecoms, state insurance, Bank of New Zealand, and the government printing office. Some sales went so poorly that the government had to step back in. For example, Air New Zealand and New Zealand Rail, now Kiwi Rail, collapsed under private management and had to be bought back using taxpayer money. Here's a question that I don't even think Google's going to answer. Does the New Zealand government have a positive track record in terms of improving quality of life affordability of, well, I'm just going to say affordability. Does the New Zealand government have a positive track record in terms of improving quality of life, affordability, and employment opportunities for the average New Zealander? There is no single answer, and this is fair. That's fair. But that's really my question. Okay? Um, And this is exactly what you're going to use. Hey, don't worry, we have improved your life because now instead of a future, you have pronouns. So you don't have to worry about have it like any of your instinctual desires to have a family, because at least now you can be as gay as you like, and no one can say anything about it. And that's mean. And you can there's now no morality whatsoever to consider when making decisions, or behaving in any. You could just do whatever you want. You live in complete freedom now. The modern New Zealand economy is far more dynamic, open, and diverse than the highly restricted insular economy of the 1970s. The removal of strict regulations allowed new industries like tech, specialized manufacturing, viticulture, and modern tourism to flourish, creating a broader variety of career paths. Okay, so the idea that the government could possibly be responsible for improvements and allowing industries like tech, specialized manufacturing, modern tourism. Like, you don't need the government to allow you to start a tech company. Like, that's people do things. Material quality of life. On a macro level, inflation-adjusted GDP per capita has doubled. This economic growth has given New Zealanders access to a vast array of cheaper consumer goods, advanced technology, better vehicles, and global supply chains that did not exist 50 years ago. I would argue that maybe the cheaper consumer goods are not actually better vehicles. Like, the cheaper vehicles, the cheaper consumer goods aren't better. Like, if you bought a Toyota Corolla, okay, again, I'll run this past Google, but I can no shit just give a story out of my own ass. There is a well-known story of million km Corolla. This bloke in Australia, who the 2 million km Corolla. It's always a Toyota, right? That or a Honda. So a Toyota Corolla making 2 million kilometers or 1.24 million miles isn't even a headline grabber in itself until you point out that New Zealand's Graham Hebley has made the journey without replacing the engine, the transmission, the drivetrain, or even the bodywork. This guy's regularly serviced his 1993 imported car, bought with 80,000 Ks already on the clock, and he managed to get it to do 2 million kilometers without replacing a major part. Because it was made in 1996, and despite the fact that it's got no battery, and it's not an e-vehicle, and it's not a hybrid, and it hasn't got regenerative braking, it weighs probably way less than a modern car, probably used just as much total energy as a modern car, despite having a less efficient motor, and because it lasted, presumably to this day, it has never needed to be replaced. So that car has done the job of 30 yearly upgrades. If you were going to buy a new car or get a new lease car every year or every 2 years or every 4 years, he's at least improved the economical impact of this car by like 7 times. Now, just to put it into perspective, I'm currently driving a borrowed car. It is a 2012 Subaru, and I've got a 1989 Subaru, for instance, which has over 200,000 Ks on the clock, and the engine is mint with a phenomenal compression ratio, still runs mint to this day at 200,000. And then I've also got this modern one, which has stop-start technology to make it more economical. It's a car which is much heavier thanks to all the safety systems, thanks to the computers and the airbags and all this stuff. And it's way more economical thanks to the stop-start system. And I worked out the other day that if I got the total sort of max average daily saving, which is about saving me about 15 seconds of idling every day, that I was going to save approximately I think it was like $3 or 30 cents. But even then, a factor of 10, call it $30 over the course of a lifetime of a car, which was going to only last at 172,000 Ks now, and the engine is disintegrating. It's losing compression and burning oil, potentially due to the stop-start dropping oil pressure and resulting in me sort of only getting a second of dropped oil pressure and then releasing the brake and having the engine start back up again. So the car's much younger, it's dying, but it saved $30. Say, let's give it a massive increase on my original calculations, which are on a video that I did here at some point, where the car saved you $300 of gas out of the 30,000, or half the year. Let's say you did half as much driving, or let's say you somehow got twice as much mileage out of the car, okay, and you halved the cost, or the cost of petrol went down. Just say it saved you $300 out of $30,000, but in the same time that an older car would have just kept running, you will also have to replace the whole engine. And that will cost you a minimum of like $4,500. So you saved $30 in gas, or $300 in gas, call it $3,000 in gas. So if you save 10% of your total fuel costs, which was never going to happen, not even feasible, I worked it out as, I think, 0.06% of the total fuel cost. And that worked out to being $30 saved, or $3 saved. And again, it's in another video that I did. But that can't possibly make up for the additional expense of the engine actually being so poorly constructed that it requires a full replacement within the same sort of lifespan. That, you know, at that point you would have had to replace the engine. If the car did if it did 2 million Ks, you would have to replace the engine 10 times in that time. So it would cost you $45,000 in today's money minimum to keep your car on the road. This guy literally has done none of that. He's just given it oil change. He hasn't replaced a single major part. So when they say, when you read that economic growth has given New Zealanders or Westerners or modern people access to a vast array of cheaper consumer goods, advanced technology, better vehicles, and global supply chains that did not exist 50 years ago, what do you have that has improved your life since then? You've got a phone which has enslaved your mind and made you extremely anxious, fills your head with fear, and causes you to compare yourself to other people you never would have even come into contact with before. And you also have spyware on your shit, better vehicles, apparently. But that's simply not the case, as I've just discussed. And you also have global supply chains. I'm so glad I got global supply chains, man. I don't know what I would do if I didn't have global supply chains. I mean, being able to afford locally produced food wouldn't be worth losing access to global supply chains that didn't exist 50 years ago. And here's the kicker: social freedoms and inclusivity. Government policies over the last few decades have significantly advanced human rights, gender equality in the workplace, and formal recognition of the Treaty of Waitangi obligations, creating a more inclusive society for minority groups and women. Really? Again, I think that's really dependent on where you fall on that issue. And without getting too deep into it, I think there's a lot of women that feel probably quite disenfranchised by these same changes, because it's allowed for men who identify as women to start entering traditionally women's only spaces. But without getting too deep into that, let's get into the negative track record, where things worsened. Well, we now have modern tourism, we got advanced technology, and we got a more inclusive society. So what did we pay? Well, the government has overseen a severe decoupling of house prices from household incomes. The transition of housing from an affordable social utility to a speculative commodity is widely viewed as a major policy failure across successive administrations, leaving the current generation facing severe housing stress. The cost of living inflation. Despite higher national productivity, everyday essentials like food, utilities, and insurance remain exceptionally high compared to the rest of the OECD. Critics argue that a historic failure to regulate domestic monopolies, such as the grocery duopoly and building materials sector, has penalised the average consumer's wallet. And finally, infrastructure deficit. While the government shifted away from owning commercial businesses to focus on public services, decades of underinvestment have left New Zealand with a massive deficit in basic infrastructure, visible in strained hospitals, school maintenance backlogs, and failing water networks. So, without getting too deep into Google's opinion on it, I feel like our generation got let down a little bit. I don't feel that confident about the future unless we can get people away from this idea that the government, who have just consistently destroyed everything and made everything much worse, and it's both sides, both wings of the same flightless bird, both wings of the same fighter jet, as I say, that in any case, it's gotten worse. And I would actually say that maybe we should give Winston Peters a turn. in New Zealand. Like, is that fair? That's fair, eh?
That's pretty fair.
That's fair.
I think the old man deserves a go.
I think after all this time,
what are the better options?
I think we give him an honorary turn. Anyways, hey, look, I've got visitors, so I'm going to stop. But that's all I've got to say on that. I meant to have a chat for 5 minutes, but just ask Google some questions about, because if you're going to use AI and you're not, if you can peel yourself away from generating videos of penguins tap dancing, then you could always ask some questions about how the economy has improved for you over the course of your lifetime. Because I certainly feel that it's gotten much better for some reason. And don't worry about anything, ever. And don't even talk about it. Don't even talk about it. All good?